There is a quiet, unexpected moment when absolutely everything shifts inside you. Not because you desperately prayed louder or tried exhausting new techniques, but because you finally heard exactly what Jesus actually meant when he said, "My peace I leave with you." For 2,000 years, millions of sincere seekers have read those majestic words and tragically misunderstood them. They felt mild, temporary comfort. But Joel Goldsmith heard something infinitely deeper, a literal, breathtaking transmission of consciousness itself. This majestic peace Jesus spoke of is absolutely not the temporary absence of earthly conflict. It is not the fragile, fleeting relief you feel when your human problems miraculously disappear. It is not the shallow, emotional calm after a devastating storm. This unshakable peace exists completely before the storm, directly during the storm, and entirely after the storm. The devastating tragedy is that the vast majority of humanity spends their entire earthly lives desperately searching entirely outside themselves for this peace. They frantically look for it in human relationships, in financial success, in physical healing, or in conditional answers from a distant heaven. Joel Goldsmith spent decades unlocking this breathtaking teaching. He majestically discovered that Jesus was absolutely not offering cheap human sympathy or fragile encouragement. He was transmitting an actual, eternal state of spiritual reality. This peace is absolutely not a destination you must exhaustingly pursue or beg to receive. It is the very ground of your being, a magnificent consciousness you absolutely already carry, completely without knowing it. Prepare to permanently end your exhausting search. You are about to discover the absolute difference between the fragile peace the world conditionally gives and the indestructible peace of Christ that permanently transforms exactly how you move through human existence. The devastating tragedy is that millions of sincere spiritual seekers have read these majestic words their entire earthly lives, yet they continually, frantically search entirely outside themselves for this elusive peace. They exhaustingly look for it in fragile human relationships, in fleeting financial success, in miraculous physical healing, and in desperate answers from a distant heaven. And yet, right here, Jesus said with absolute, unshakable clarity, "My peace." He was absolutely not offering the world's cheap peace. He was not offering a conditional reward for good human behavior. Something breathtakingly, altogether different, is being majestically offered in those sacred words. Joel Goldsmith made a profound, earth-shattering distinction that completely changes absolutely everything about your spiritual journey. He fiercely taught that the fragile world offers exactly one kind of peace. It is terrifyingly temporary, devastatingly fragile, and entirely dependent on highly unstable outer conditions. But the majestic peace of Christ is a profound peace that completely passes all human understanding. It absolutely cannot be intellectually explained. It absolutely cannot be exhaustingly earned through rigid religious effort. It can only be beautifully received through a monumental shift in consciousness that begins the exact moment you completely stop desperately seeking it outside yourself. The vast majority of spiritual seekers spend agonizing years trapped in that exhausting cycle, frantically praying for peace, terrifyingly losing it, and desperately praying again. They tragically mistake cheap emotional relief for profound spiritual peace. They confuse temporarily answered prayers with absolute divine contact. Goldsmith was brutally direct about this devastating illusion. As long as you are exhaustingly seeking peace from God as an external, distant source, you have absolutely not yet touched exactly what Jesus was majestically pointing toward in that sacred moment. This breathtaking teaching asks something profoundly radical of your terrified human mind. It demands that you absolutely stop treating spiritual peace as a distant, future destination. Unshakable peace is absolutely not waiting for you on the other side of your miraculous physical healing. Your difficult relationship reconciliation, or your desperate financial breakthrough, majestic peace is the absolute, unshakable ground of your very being, the exact consciousness that flawlessly animates you right now. What Jesus miraculously left is absolutely already present directly within you, waiting absolutely not to be frantically found, but to be quietly, beautifully recognized. That profound recognition permanently changes the entire trajectory of your human existence. You completely stop running exhaustingly towards something, and you beautifully begin resting completely in something. When Jesus majestically said, "Not as the world giveth," he was fiercely drawing an absolute, unshakable line in the spiritual sand. The fragile world gives conditionally. The terrified world gives temporarily. The arrogant world gives exactly what it can violently take back. Every single cheap piece the earthly world offers has a terrifying expiration date. You feel momentarily peaceful when the medical diagnosis is magically good. You feel peaceful when your human relationship is temporarily stable. You feel peaceful when the human money is safely in the bank. But that fragile, conditional peace is always exactly one terrifying phone call away from absolute collapse. Goldsmith profoundly taught that this was the central, devastating illusion, keeping all of humanity completely trapped in agonizing suffering. We have been heavily trained from birth to desperately seek our entire well-being in highly unstable external conditions. Therefore, when Jesus majestically announces, "I give you peace," but absolutely not as the world gives, he is breathtakingly announcing a completely different, eternal economy of spirit, one where your precious inner state is absolutely no longer held hostage to terrifying outer circumstances. This absolutely does not mean you become coldly indifferent to human life. It does not mean you arrogantly stop caring about your health, your loved ones, or the chaotic world around you. It profoundly means your absolute foundation permanently shifts. You beautifully begin to act directly from unshakable peace, rather than desperately searching for it. You begin to majestically give from absolute spiritual fullness, rather than exhaustingly bargaining from terrified human lack. The entire exquisite quality of exactly how you move through the earthly world permanently transforms. This breathtaking shift does not happen merely as empty theology or shallow intellectual philosophy. It becomes a lived, breathed, beautifully embodied truth, deep within your very bones. That profound shift from exhausting, desperate seeking to majestic, unshakable resting is exactly what Joel Goldsmith profoundly called the absolute beginning of the true mystical life. And it flawlessly starts the exact moment you truly, deeply hear exactly what Jesus was majestically transmitting in those few extraordinary, eternal words. The frantic seeking completely quiets. The terrified human grasping permanently softens. In that profound stillness, you finally touch the living presence of the divine. You are absolutely, eternally free from the world's exhausting game. Let us look at the living evidence of exactly what happens when sincere individuals completely abandon their exhausting search. Consider Thomas, a man in his 50s who spent 30 agonizing years completely immersed in traditional church life. He knew the scriptures perfectly and attended services faithfully. Yet he carried a devastating secret. He had absolutely never felt genuine, unshakable peace. He prayed for it constantly, desperately begging God for relief from the crippling anxiety that violently shadowed his every waking moment. During a terrifying season of simultaneous crises, a health scare, crushing financial pressure, and a strained marriage, he discovered Goldsmith's writings. He expected more empty theology. Instead, he encountered a truth that stopped him completely. Peace is absolutely not a fragile gift God conditionally gives in response to desperate prayer. It is the very nature of God, absolutely already present within you. You absolutely do not ask for what you already are. That single, majestic insight completely cracked his spiritual universe open. For the very first time, Thomas completely stopped begging and beautifully started listening. He stopped anxiously asking for peace and started profoundly noticing the unshakable quiet existing directly beneath his anxiety. The transformation was not cinematic or instant, but it was absolutely real. Week by week, the terrifying grip of anxiety loosened, and Thomas beautifully learned to inhabit the majestic peace he had spent 30 years desperately chasing. Next, look at Susan, a highly successful therapist who prided herself on flawlessly helping others find emotional balance. She possessed endless intellectual tools and frameworks for every kind of inner human struggle. But privately, Susan carried a devastating, agonizing restlessness she could not even name. She was professionally calm, but personally fragmented, quietly drowning in her own unresolved, exhausting, searching, while helping others seek peace. When she was introduced to Goldsmith, she expected shallow spiritual platitudes. Instead, she found breathtaking precision. Goldsmith majestically described the peace of Christ absolutely not as a fleeting human feeling to be exhaustingly cultivated, but as an eternal, indestructible reality to be beautifully unveiled. That profound distinction violently broke through her heavy therapeutic armor. Susan began fiercely practicing what Goldsmith called the listening silence, absolutely not traditional meditation to forcefully fix her mind. Buta deliberate, majestic turning of attention entirely inward, simply to rest in the pure awareness that peace absolutely already exists beneath the surface noise. Over several quiet months, something foundational completely changed. Her demanding caseload and complex personal life absolutely did not miraculously disappear. What permanently changed was her entire relationship to all of it. The majestic peace she had spent her life helping others desperately seek had quietly, steadily become her own unshakable lived experience. Finally, consider Derek, A young man who was terrifyingly told at 28 that his severe chronic illness was something he would simply have to agonizingly manage for the rest of his earthly life. He obediently took his medications, but inside, he carried a devastating, silent spiritual grief, a heavy sense that something essential had been permanently surrendered. He discovered Goldsmith's Practicing the Presence through his late grandmother. He began reading it absolutely not because it promised a miraculous physical healing. Goldsmith was fiercely careful never to make such cheap promises, but because it majestically offered the breathtaking possibility of a profound peace that absolutely did not depend on his fragile body's cooperation. Derek bravely began the practice entirely, without arrogant expectations of physical change. He started with 10 quiet minutes daily, beautifully releasing the terrifying mental commentary about his physical condition, and turning his attention entirely toward the inner quiet. Months passed. His medical situation tragically remained complex, but Derek himself permanently transformed into someone. His doctors quietly marveled at a patient possessing a majestic, unshakable stillness that seemed to emanate from a dimension entirely beyond human coping. He had absolutely not been physically healed, but he had miraculously found exactly what Jesus promised: the indestructible peace that the fragile world absolutely cannot give and can never, ever take away. These profound stories, Thomas the churchgoer, Susan the therapist, and Derek the chronically ill young man, are absolutely not isolated exceptions. They are the undeniable, magnificent examples of exactly what becomes miraculously possible when a single, majestic shift in spiritual understanding deeply takes root in a willing human heart. They did not experience cheap, overnight transformations. They experienced the absolute, life-altering discovery of an indestructible peace that was always already there. Beyond the breathtaking foundational shift from desperate seeking to unshakable resting, Joel Goldsmith fiercely taught 4 profound, complementary practices designed to effortlessly anchor you in the eternal peace of Christ. The first of these is exactly what he majestically called the silence. This is absolutely not about attempting to force a blank mental state. And it is certainly not about cheap physical relaxation. The silence is a highly specific, profound act of absolute inner listening, a deliberate turning of your conscious attention entirely toward the presence of God already established within you. Most traditional religious practices exhaustingly move in the entirely wrong direction, outward. We anxiously speak prayers outward. We direct visualizations outward. And we desperately send requests upward toward a God we falsely imagine as distant. Goldsmith reversed this completely. He fiercely taught that because the kingdom is within, the entire direction of genuine spiritual practice must be profoundly inward. Your terrified human mind will violently resist this pure receptivity. It desperately wants to ask, negotiate, and plan. Simply sit quietly. Completely release the exhausting urge to ask for a single thing, and majestically acknowledge the peace of Christ is absolutely already present. I am absolutely not seeking it. I am resting in it. You are not forcefully creating peace. You are beautifully removing the dense mental noise that conceals it. The second majestic practice is the profound teaching of impersonalization. When you face a terrifying illness, crushing financial pressure, or agonizing emotional conflict, The fragile human response is to instantly make it deeply, violently personal. This is my disease. This is my devastating failure. This is happening to me. This devastating personalization violently intensifies your suffering and completely obscures the spiritual solution. Goldsmith fiercely taught that absolutely no problem has a personal owner. It is not your disease. It is entirely an impersonal appearance within the universal dream of separation. The exact moment you permanently stop owning the problem, you completely stop feeding it with the heavy energy of personal identity. There is a breathtaking difference between agonizingly declaring, "I am sick," and majestically recognizing there is merely an impersonal appearance of sickness present. The first statement violently locks you in a prison. The second creates a magnificent space of absolute spiritual freedom between your true identity in Christ and the temporary earthly condition. The third profound practice is exactly what Goldsmith called nothingization. This means majestically recognizing the absolute nothingness of earthly error and limitation, absolutely not by frantically fighting it or desperately praying against it, but by completely withdrawing your belief in its reality. Traditional approaches treat problems as real, terrifying adversaries to be violently overcome. Goldsmith's mystical approach treats them as entirely unreal appearances to be beautifully seen through. When you exhaustingly fight a problem, you violently give it reality. Every single ounce of energy you direct toward defeating an earthly adversary tragically confirms that it has genuine, independent power over you. Jesus absolutely did not heal by battling disease. He healed by majestically knowing the absolute truth that disease has absolutely no divine reality. When terrifying fear arises, simply acknowledge, this has absolutely no divine reality. There is no law of God supporting this fear. It is merely an appearance completely without spiritual substance. The fourth essential tool is practicing the presence. This is the continuous, gentle returning of your awareness to the majestic truth that God's presence is entirely with you right now. Most of humanity lives entirely at the terrified surface of experience, reacting blindly to chaotic events as though they are fighting to stay afloat completely alone in a raging current. Practicing the presence is the unshakable recognition that you are absolutely never alone in the current. The infinite intelligence is exactly as present in your chaotic Tuesday afternoon traffic jam as it was in the sacred upper room. You absolutely do not need special conditions. You simply need the brave willingness to quietly remember, in the very middle of a terrifying crisis, gently remind yourself, I am not managing this alone. The peace that passes understanding is active right now. When you forget, and you inevitably will, especially in the early stages, simply return without a single ounce of self-judgment. Each gentle return is a magnificent step deeper into your eternal inheritance. Let us speak with absolute, unshakable honesty about a terrifying truth that Joel Goldsmith never, ever avoided. This majestic path has devastating human challenges, and one of the absolute most agonizing is the terrifying experience of absolutely nothing happening. You faithfully sit in the silence. You bravely practice impersonalization. You beautifully acknowledge the presence. And yet, your devastating circumstances remain entirely, violently unchanged. The terrifying illness persists. The agonizing relationship stays broken. The crushing financial pressure absolutely does not lift. The fragile human mind violently whispers, "Am I doing something wrong? Is this mystical practice even working?" Goldsmith addressed this terrifying doubt with profound, absolute compassion. He fiercely taught that the temporary absence of visible outer change absolutely does not mean the majestic practice is failing. The profound work of consciousness flawlessly happens at a depth entirely beneath the physical. Visible realm. Exactly like massive, unshakable roots growing deep underground, long before a single green shoot ever appears above the surface. Spiritual recognition works inwardly before it, miraculously manifests outwardly. The earthly time frame is absolutely not yours to arrogantly control. Your only part is unshakable faithfulness to the practice. The second massive challenge is devastating spiritual impatience. We live in a fragile, anxious human culture heavily trained for immediate, cinematic feedback. When we violently bring that arrogant expectation into sacred spiritual practice, we create a massive, subtle obstacle. We tragically turn this majestic practice into a cheap technique for getting earthly things, rather than a profound way of being that transforms absolutely everything. Goldsmith was brutally clear. The peace of Christ is absolutely not a cheap tool for earthly manifestation. If you exhaustingly approach the silence as a method to heal your physical body faster, or to magically solve your crushing financial problem, you have absolutely missed the central, majestic point. You are still completely operating within the terrifying world's economy, frantically using spiritual currency to purchase fragile outer conditions. Genuine practice requires a breathtaking willingness to seek peace entirely for its own sake. Absolutely not for the miraculous healing it might bring. When peace genuinely becomes your absolute only motivation, the outer life miraculously finds its own flawless ordering. The third terrifying challenge is the devastating interference of well-meaning, toxic religious belief. Many sincere seekers carry deeply ingrained, heavy ideas about exactly how God supposedly works. Goldsmith fiercely observed that these religious assumptions absolutely block the very sacred experience they are meant to facilitate. If you carry the false, exhausting idea that God conditionally rewards the faithful with earthly blessings, your majestic practice will constantly be violently sabotaged by the expectation of bargained results. If you carry the horrifying belief that your personal suffering is God's will, a divine punishment, or a cruel test of character, you will approach the silence, falsely believing you must pass an earthly test before receiving peace. Goldsmith boldly called this leaning on the arm of flesh, relying on fragile human concepts of God rather than the direct, breathtaking experience of divine presence. You must bravely, courageously set aside what you think you know about theology. The peace of Christ is absolutely experiential, entirely not doctrinal. It is found exclusive, sanctuary in the living silence, completely beneath all human ideas. Consider the profound story of Gloria, a devoted pastor's wife who had lived entirely inside institutional religion her whole life. She loved her faith, but after decades of exhausting, faithful service, she tragically confided that she had absolutely never experienced genuine inner peace. She had felt joy and inspiration, but unshakable peace remained entirely elusive. When introduced to Goldsmith's listening silence, she violently resisted. It felt too passive, too dangerously mystical for her active religious mind. But she bravely began practicing quietly, early each morning. For the first agonizing weeks, she felt absolutely nothing, just her own terrified thoughts circling endlessly in the dark. But Gloria persisted with majestic patience, completely without demanding instant results. Then, one quiet morning around the 6th week, something breathtaking happened. In the very middle of her ordinary sitting, she became profoundly aware of a majestic stillness that was absolutely not of her own making. It was simply there, vast, unhurried, completely and eternally at rest. She was terrified to move, desperately fearing it would leave. But she finally, beautifully understood it was absolutely not going anywhere. It had always, eternally been there, waiting directly beneath her religious exhaustion for her to finally stop seeking. There is one final, devastating obstacle that Joel Goldsmith addressed with profound, unshakable compassion in his later writings, the terrifying human obstacle of unworthiness. Many sincere seekers, even after agonizing years of spiritual practice, carry a quiet but tenacious belief that this majestic level of peace is available to others, but absolutely not fully to them. They falsely believe their specific history, their personal failures, and their heavy accumulation of earthly errors have placed them at a permanent distance from the inheritance. Jesus left. Goldsmith fiercely shattered this illusion. He boldly declared that spiritual peace is absolutely not distributed according to human moral merit. It is entirely not a conditional reward for a perfectly clean record. It is the exact nature of consciousness itself, which is the absolute true nature of every single human being, without exception, completely, regardless of your complicated history, your past behavior, or your terrifying doubts. The peace of Christ was magnificently left to all of humanity, absolutely not exclusively to the already perfected. If you have been exhaustingly waiting until you feel worthy, until you have meditated enough, forgiven enough, or grown enough, you have tragically been postponing the exact experience that would permanently transform your life. Here is the breathtaking, ultimate truth. You absolutely do not clean yourself up and then approach the presence of God. You approach the presence of God, and you are completely, beautifully cleaned up by the majestic encounter. The sequence matters entirely. Come exactly as you are. Bring your heavy doubt. Bring your terrifying inconsistency. Bring your deeply unresolved questions. The silence absolutely does not require your fragile human credentials. The peace Christ left does not check your moral record before receiving you. You are already eternally within it. The absolute only question is whether today, right now, you are brave enough to completely stop arguing with that truth and simply rest in it. You now stand at the magnificent threshold of a genuinely transformed relationship with your entire existence. Not because you have mastered a cheap human technique, but because you have finally heard, perhaps for the very first time, with ears that can truly receive it, exactly what Jesus meant when he spoke those majestic words. My peace I leave with you. This indestructible peace is absolutely not coming in the distant future. It is already here. It is not exhaustingly earned. It is freely given. It is the unshakable peace of a consciousness that has majestically recognized its own divine nature. remaining perfectly steady beneath every terrifying storm. Your path from here is beautifully clear. Practice the silence daily. Majestically return to the presence in the middle of your chaotic, ordinary moments. Hold yourself and others entirely in the recognition of spiritual truth, rather than in the terrifying fear of appearances. Give this profound practice your faithful attention, and watch as the peace that passes understanding permanently reorganizes your entire inner life from the ground up. You absolutely already carry exactly what Jesus left. Today, you are finally choosing to live directly from it. If your understanding of Christ's peace has been genuinely transformed through these suppressed Goldsmith teachings, let your exhausted mind finally rest. Like this video, so other desperate seekers can find this majestic inheritance. Subscribe to continue this breathtaking journey into mystical Christianity. And powerfully comment the words, "My peace," below to permanently declare that you are claiming the eternal inheritance. Jesus left the indestructible peace the fragile world absolutely cannot give and can never, ever take away.